January 9, 2026, across Tehran and dozens of Iranian cities, demonstrations were reaching their peak after nearly 2 weeks of economic protests. American President Donald Trump was threatening military intervention to protect protesters.
Iran's in big trouble. It looks to me that the people are taking over certain cities that nobody thought were really possible just a few weeks ago. We're watching the situation very carefully. I've made the statement very strongly that if they start killing people like they have in the past, we will get involved. We'll be hitting them very hard where it hurts.
While Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu was publicly calling for regime change, and Western media outlets were declaring the immediate collapse of the Islamic Republic. Just 6 months earlier, U.S. and Israeli forces had struck Iran's nuclear facilities with unprecedented force, deploying the most powerful conventional weapons in the American stockpile. The messaging from Washington and Tel Aviv was clear. Pressure works, Iran is weak, and the regime is isolated and vulnerable. Then something unexpected happened. By January 12, massive pro-government rallies filled the same streets where anti-regime protests had occurred days before. Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei appeared on state television, not defiant and cornered, but confident, thanking Iranians for what he called their warning to the United States. The protests, while real and significant, had not toppled the government. The nuclear strikes, while damaging, had not destroyed Iran's program. The sanctions, the military pressure, the calls for revolution, none of it produced the outcome Western planners had anticipated. Instead, 6 months of escalating confrontation had exposed something Western strategists seemed not to have fully grasped. Iran's society had a toughness, and its government retained a level of support that external pressure alone could not overcome. How did the strategy of maximum pressure, backed by the most sophisticated military technology on Earth, fail to achieve its objectives? And what does that failure reveal about the limits of coercion in the modern Middle East? To understand who was behind these protests and what they hoped to achieve, we need to go through what happened during the 12-day war 6 months earlier. On June 13th, Operation Rising Lion began as Israel launched a massive surprise attack on Iran.
Moments ago, Israel launched Operation Rising Lion, a targeted military operation to roll back the Iranian threat to Israel's very survival. This operation will continue for as many days as it takes to remove this threat.
200 Israeli fighter jets struck nuclear and military facilities across 27 Iranian provinces. The operation's scope was unprecedented. Wave after wave of F-35 stealth fighters and F-15 strike aircraft penetrated Iranian airspace, hitting targets from the Caspian Sea coast to the Persian Gulf. Israeli forces targeted and eliminated approximately 30 senior Iranian military commanders, including Iranian Armed Forces Chief of Staff Mohammad Bagheri, Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps Commander Hossein Salami, and multiple other top officials. The strikes killed these commanders in coordinated attacks on command centers, military bases, and secure facilities across the country. 15 nuclear scientists were also killed in the strikes, many of them targeted at their homes or while traveling to work. Critical nuclear facilities at Natanz, Fordow, and Isfahan were hit repeatedly with precision-guided munitions designed to penetrate hardened structures. For 9 days, Israeli aircraft operated over Iranian airspace with remarkable freedom. Iran's air defense systems, already damaged in an October 2024 strike that had destroyed advanced radar installations and command nodes, proved unable to prevent the sustained attacks. Iranian fighters scrambled to intercept the strikes but failed to shoot down a single Israeli aircraft during the initial phase of the campaign. By June 22nd, Israel had conducted 360 strikes across Iran, hitting not just nuclear facilities but also missile production plants, drone manufacturing sites, and weapon storage depots. The Israeli government presented the operation as a decisive blow that would set back Iran's nuclear program by years and fundamentally alter the strategic balance in the Middle East. Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu announced that Israel was eliminating Iran's nuclear threat permanently, calling it a historic operation that would guarantee Israeli security for decades. But as the war progressed, Israeli military planners confronted 2 uncomfortable realities. First, Israel alone lacked the capability to destroy Iran's most critical nuclear facilities. The deeply buried chambers at Fordow, located 80 to 90 meters underground inside a mountain, were beyond the reach of Israel's conventional weapons. Israeli bunker-buster bombs simply could not penetrate deep enough to reach the centrifuges and enriched uranium stored in these hardened sites. Second, Iran proved far more aggressive in its retaliation than Israeli intelligence had anticipated. Netanyahu faced a choice: accept that Israel's operation would leave Iran's most critical nuclear infrastructure intact, or bring in the only power that possessed weapons capable of reaching those depths. Based Based on what followed, the decision appears to have been made to request American involvement. Then the United States joined the war. On June 22nd, 7 B-2 Spirit stealth bombers took off on an 18-hour mission to strike 3 Iranian nuclear sites. The operation, codenamed Midnight Hammer, deployed weapons that only the United States possessed. 14 massive ordnance penetrators, each weighing 30,000 pounds, were dropped on the Fordow and Natanz nuclear facilities. These bunker-buster bombs had been specifically designed over 15 years to penetrate the fortified underground chambers where Iran enriched uranium. President Trump announced that Iran's nuclear facilities had been completely and totally obliterated.
A short time ago, the U.S. military carried out massive precision strikes on the 3 key nuclear facilities in the Iranian regime: Fordow, Natanz, and Isfahan. Everybody heard those names for years as they built this horribly destructive enterprise. Our objective was the destruction of Iran's nuclear enrichment capacity and a stop to the nuclear threat posed by the world's #1 state sponsor of terror. Tonight, I can report to the world that the strikes were a spectacular military success.
But within days, a very different picture began to emerge. A classified Defense Intelligence Agency assessment concluded that the U.S. strikes had likely only set back Iran's nuclear program by maybe a few months tops. The bunker-buster bombs, despite their massive explosive power, had not fully penetrated to the depths where Iran's centrifuges and enriched uranium were stored. Damage was largely restricted to above-ground structures and power infrastructure. The centrifuges remained largely intact. Iran's stockpile of highly enriched uranium had not been destroyed, and intelligence suggested it had been moved prior to the strikes. Perhaps most concerning, U.S. officials believed Iran maintained secret nuclear facilities that had not been targeted and remained fully operational. The gap between Trump's public claims of obliteration and America's own classified intelligence revealed something uncomfortable. Even the most powerful conventional weapons in the American stockpile could not fully destroy a determined enemy's buried infrastructure. This may seem contradictory. How could the most devastating military strikes in modern history, using weapons specifically designed over 15 years to destroy these exact targets, fail to achieve their stated objectives? The answer lies in a fundamental miscalculation about the limits of military power, but we'll return to that. First, we need to understand the full cost of what this operation actually achieved. Israel's military performance during the 12-day war diverged sharply from the triumphant narrative presented to the public. Iran retaliated with over 550 ballistic missiles and approximately 1,000 drones. While Israeli and American air defenses intercepted roughly 90% of incoming threats, the 10% that penetrated left 22,800 Israelis dead and 3,491 injured. Iranian strikes shut down Israel's largest oil refinery in Haifa for 2 weeks and hit the Diamond Exchange, which represented 8% of Israel's exports. Israel spent $12 billion in 12 days, with some analysts projecting the true cost could approach $20 billion. More troubling still, Iran's missile success rate doubled from 8 to 16% as Iranian forces adapted their tactics, while Israeli missile stockpiles depleted dangerously low. The Wall Street Journal reported Israel's inventory of defensive missiles was running out by the war's final days. The war ended on June 24th under U.S. pressure, with both sides claiming victory. Netanyahu declared a historic triumph and vowed to prevent Iran from rebuilding. Iranian officials, while acknowledging severe damage, emphasized that they had struck back and forced a ceasefire. The human cost in Iran was staggering. Over 1,000 Iranians were killed during the 12-day war, according to human rights monitoring groups. The dead included not just military personnel and government officials, but also civilians caught in strikes on dual-use facilities, workers at nuclear and missile sites, and residents of neighborhoods near military installations. Iranian state media broadcast funerals for fallen commanders, Revolutionary Guard members, and Basij militia fighters, turning the ceremonies into public displays of defiance against Israel and the United States. The strikes had destroyed significant portions of Iran's missile production capacity, damaged critical nuclear infrastructure, and eliminated an entire generation of senior military leadership. Yet Iran had demonstrated something that would prove significant 6 months later: the capacity to absorb devastating punishment, retaliate effectively despite enormous military disadvantages, and maintain governmental cohesion through a crisis that would have shattered less organized states. The consequences of these miscalculations would become painfully apparent 6 months later. By late December 2025, Iran's economy was in severe crisis. The national currency, the rial, had collapsed to 1.45 million per US dollar. Official inflation reached 48%, though independent Independent economists estimated the real figure approached 80%. Food prices were soaring beyond the reach of working-class families. Unemployment was rising. The combination of long-standing sanctions, the costs of the June war, and chronic government mismanagement had pushed millions of Iranians toward desperation. On December 28, 2025, protests erupted across Iran. What began as demonstrations against economic conditions in several cities rapidly spread to 185 cities and towns across all 31 Iranian provinces. The protests were organic expressions of genuine economic frustration. In Tehran, crowds gathered in working-class neighborhoods chanting slogans about bread prices and government corruption. In Mashhad, Iran's second-largest city and a traditionally conservative stronghold, protesters marched through the streets demanding economic relief. Isfahan, Shiraz, Tabriz, Ahaz, and Kermanshah all saw significant demonstrations. The chants focused on concrete economic grievances, the collapsing currency, soaring food costs, unemployment, and the perception that government officials lived in luxury while ordinary Iranians struggled to afford basic necessities. Videos circulated on social media showing the scale and intensity of the demonstrations. Protesters blocked major highways, set fire to government buildings, and confronted security forces in street battles. The geographic spread was particularly significant. These were not just protests in Tehran or other major urban centers that had seen demonstrations during previous waves of unrest in 2009, 2017, and 2019. Smaller cities, provincial towns, and even some rural areas saw protests, suggesting that economic anger had penetrated deep into Iranian society across regional, ethnic, and class lines. The scale and spontaneity suggested deep popular frustration at the government's economic failures and the perception that years of sanctions, war costs, and mismanagement had pushed millions of Iranians toward desperation with no relief in sight. Western governments and media outlets interpreted the protests as validation of their pressure strategy. Trump renewed threats of military intervention. Netanyahu suggested the protests could lead to regime change. Exiled opposition figure Reza Pahlavi called for protesters to seize city centers and promised to return to Iran. American and Israeli officials appeared to believe their moment had arrived, yet the situation proved far more complicated than these confident predictions suggested. The protests became entangled in competing narratives about foreign involvement that would ultimately serve the regime's interests regardless of their truth. Iranian authorities claimed Israeli intelligence operatives had infiltrated the demonstrations, pointing to former CIA Director Mike Pompeo's public tweet supporting Mossad agents walking beside Iranian protesters. The tweet, posted on January 2nd, was interpreted by Iranian officials as an admission that Western intelligence services were actively involved in organizing and directing the protests. Tehran broadcast confessions from arrested individuals alleging Mossad connections, showing men claiming they had been recruited by Israeli intelligence to incite violence, target specific buildings, and coordinate with protest leaders. Iranian officials highlighted that dozens of mosques were set ablaze during the protests, with Tehran's mayor reporting that more than 30 mosques had been burned. The government argued that Iranians, even those deeply opposed to the regime, would never burn religious sites, and therefore this proved foreign infiltrators were deliberately trying to inflame sectarian tensions and delegitimize the Islamic Republic. Western governments characterized the protests as genuine expressions of economic frustration that the regime was attempting to delegitimize through accusations of foreign interference. They pointed out that the confessions broadcast on Iranian state television followed a well-documented pattern of coerced statements extracted through detention and psychological pressure, a tactic human rights groups had tracked for decades. The mosque burnings and vandalism occurred amid chaotic confrontations where protesters targeted various symbols of state authority, including banks, government buildings, police stations, and yes, some mosques associated with the regime. Whether these acts reflected organic rage against all institutions connected to the government or deliberate provocations by infiltrators as Tehran claimed remained impossible to verify due to the internet blackout and lack of transparent investigation. What matters for understanding the strategy's failure is this: whether Mossad agents were present or not, the foreign involvement narrative, real or perceived, provided the Iranian government exactly the propaganda tool it needed to frame economic protests as foreign plots and rally nationalist support support against external interference. The very presence of Pompeo's tweet, regardless of whether it reflected operational reality or was merely rhetorical support for Iranian dissidents, gave Iranian authorities a tangible piece of evidence they could broadcast to domestic and international audiences. And Mossad's documented operational history in Iran meant the claims could not be easily dismissed as pure fabrication. During the June war, Israel publicly acknowledged having over 100 agents operating inside Iran who had sabotaged air defense systems, provided targeting data for strikes. The agency has conducted multiple high-profile assassinations of Iranian nuclear scientists over the past 2 decades, launched sophisticated cyber attacks including the Stuxnet virus that damaged nuclear centrifuges, and recruited networks of informants within Iran's scientific, military, and governmental institutions. Given this established pattern of deep penetration into Iranian society, the presence of Israeli intelligence assets during a period of mass unrest would align with standard operational doctrine. The question wasn't whether Mossad could operate in Iran, which was clearly established, but whether their involvement, or even just the perception of their involvement, helped or hurt Western objectives of regime change. The regime's response was brutally effective and demonstrated organizational capacity that Western observers had underestimated. Human rights groups reported widely varying casualty figures due to the internet blackout and government censorship, with confirmed deaths ranging from several hundred, according to organizations like HANA, to claims of several thousand, though higher estimates could not be independently verified. More than 10,000 people were detained in the first 2 weeks of protests. Security forces used live ammunition in multiple cities, with videos showing police and paramilitary Basij forces firing directly into crowds. Tear gas, water cannons, and mass arrests became standard responses to gatherings of any size. Reports indicated the deployment of approximately 800 members of Iraqi Shia militias to assist in suppression, which would suggest either concerns about the reliability of some domestic forces or a desire to employ units with no compunction about using violence against Iranian citizens. Yet simultaneously, the government demonstrated it retained significant mobilization capacity and organizational coherence under pressure. Security forces coordinated responses across 31 provinces, suggesting functional command and control despite the chaos. Intelligence services conducted targeted arrests of protest organizers, labor activists, and social media influencers who had been promoting demonstrations. On January 8th, the government imposed a nationwide internet blackout, cutting off protesters from organizing tools, outside communication, and the ability to share videos of the crackdown with international media. The blackout was nearly total, reducing Iran's internet connectivity to less than 5% of normal levels and making it almost impossible for protesters to coordinate actions or document government violence. Intelligence Minister Esmail Khatib announced that security forces had arrested dozens of foreign agents connected to the protests, and state television began broadcasting their confessions within days, a remarkably fast turnaround that suggested either pre-planned operations or well-practiced procedures for extracting coerced statements. Then on January 12, massive pro-government rallies occurred in Tehran, Mashhad, Isfahan, Qom, and other cities. State television broadcast images of crowds carrying Iranian flags, portraits of Khamenei, and banners denouncing foreign interference. The government claimed millions participated, though independent verification was impossible. These rallies were clearly state-organized rather than spontaneous, but they still required people willing to participate, which indicated the regime retained constituencies it could mobilize. Supreme Leader Khamenei appeared on television thanking participants for sending a serious warning to the United States. He characterized the anti-government protests as foreign manipulation rather than legitimate grievances. The message was clear. The regime had weathered the crisis, contained the protests, and demonstrated its organizational strength. Now that we've examined the military strikes that failed to eliminate the nuclear program, the economic pressure that didn't trigger collapse, and the protests that the regime ultimately survived, the full scope of the miscalculation becomes clear. The strategy rested on 3 assumptions, all of which proved incorrect. First, that military strikes on nuclear facilities would eliminate Iran's program permanently. This assumption underestimated both the limits of kinetic weapons against deeply buried targets and Iran's technical capacity to rebuild. Iran possessed the technical knowledge, industrial capacity, and determination to reconstruct what had been destroyed. The country had been developing nuclear expertise for decades, training thousands of scientists and engineers in nuclear physics, centrifuge design, and uranium enrichment processes. This knowledge could not be bombed away. By late 2025, reports indicated Iran was already attempting to reconstruct damaged facilities, moving equipment from destroyed sites to undamaged locations and beginning to replace destroyed centrifuges with new models. The International Atomic Energy Agency confirmed it could not access the struck sites to verify the extent of damage, preventing independent assessment of whether Iran's program had been meaningfully degraded or merely temporarily disrupted. Ambassador Mike Huckabee acknowledged in December that Iran appeared to be trying to reconstitute and find a new way to dig the hole deeper and secure it more, suggesting that rather than abandoning their nuclear ambitions, Iranian scientists were learning from the strikes and designing even more resilient infrastructure. The strikes had caused temporary setbacks but not permanent elimination, and may have actually incentivized Iran to pursue even more hardened facilities and potentially move toward weaponization as the only guarantee against future attacks. Second, that economic pressure would trigger regime collapse. This assumption confused economic distress with political revolution and misunderstood how authoritarian governments survive crises. Iran's economy was indeed suffering severely. Sanctions, the costs of the war, and chronic government mismanagement had created genuine hardship for millions of Iranians. Food prices were genuinely unaffordable for many families. Unemployment was rising, particularly among young people, and the currency collapse had wiped out savings and made imported goods prohibitively expensive. But economic distress alone does not automatically translate into successful revolution, especially against governments with strong repressive capacity and organizational coherence. The regime possessed extensive security infrastructure, from the Revolutionary Guards to the Basij militia to intelligence services that had spent decades perfecting techniques for identifying, infiltrating, and neutralizing opposition movements. The government could mobilize pro-regime constituencies, including government employees, pensioners dependent on state payments, religious conservatives who genuinely supported the Islamic Republic's ideology, and beneficiaries of the regime's patronage networks. The government could deploy overwhelming force against protesters while maintaining essential services and paying security forces. And critically, the government could frame the protests as foreign manipulation in ways that resonated with portions of the population who, whatever their economic frustrations, feared chaos and instability more than they desired revolution. Third, that Iranian society would uniformly support regime change. This assumption ignored the fundamental complexity of Iranian politics and society. Iran was not a unified society awaiting liberation, but a diverse nation of 85 million people with competing visions of the country's future, deep regional and ethnic tensions, class divisions, and genuinely differing views on the role of Islam in governance and the structure of political authority. Some Iranians supported the government ideologically, believing in the Islamic Republic's founding principles and seeing the supreme leader as a legitimate religious and political authority. Others benefited from the system economically, working in government positions, state-owned enterprises, Revolutionary Guard business networks, or religious foundations that provided employment and social services. Still others opposed the regime but feared the instability and uncertainty that revolution might bring, remembering the chaos of the 1979 revolution and its aftermath, or looking at the devastation revolutions had brought to Libya, Syria, and Yemen. The millions who participated in pro-government rallies on January 12, whatever their private views and however much the rallies were state-organized, demonstrated that the regime could still mobilize support and that Iranian society was far more divided on the question of regime change than simplified Western narratives acknowledged. 6 months of maximum military and economic pressure had resulted in over 1,000 Iranian deaths during the June war, cost Israel billions of dollars, left underground nuclear facilities intact, and generated a protest movement that the regime, while struggling to contain, ultimately survived. The more pressure Washington and Tel Aviv applied, the more they exposed the fundamental limits of what external force could achieve against a determined government with meaningful domestic support. This was not to minimize the suffering of Iranians killed in protests, the genuine grievances driving demonstrations, or the authoritarian nature of the Islamic Republic's response. The crackdown was brutal. The economic situation was dire. Many Iranians desperately wanted change, but Western strategists had convinced themselves that pressure alone would force outcomes that required far more complex political transformations within Iranian society itself. Iran in early 2026 remained under severe stress. The economy was in crisis, the government faced genuine opposition, and the nuclear program had suffered setbacks. But the Islamic Republic had not collapsed, had not given up, and showed every indication of adapting to pressure pressure rather than giving into it. For U.S. and Israeli planners, the implications were significant. If overwhelming force applied against nuclear facilities could not permanently eliminate the program, if maximum economic pressure could not trigger regime change, if internal protests could not sustain momentum against repression, then what strategy could achieve the stated objective of preventing Iran from acquiring nuclear weapons? The answer to that question remained unclear as January 2026 drew to a close. The pro-government rallies on January 12 had sent a message that Western observers had not wanted to hear. The Islamic Republic, whatever its faults and however much it was hated by significant portions of the population, retained organizational strength and popular support that external pressure alone could not overcome. The regime might eventually fall to internal transformation, might negotiate under the right conditions, might evolve in ways no one could predict, but it would not collapse simply because Washington and Tel Aviv willed it to happen. What began as Israel's Operation Rising Lion in June, continued through America's midnight hammer strikes, and culminated in January's protests, had proven something strategic planners should have understood from history. Military force has limits, economic pressure has limits, and external intervention cannot substitute for internal political change. The week everything went wrong for Israel and the United States and Iran revealed that the strategy of maximum pressure, backed by overwhelming technological superiority, had reached its limits against a society more complex and a government more resilient than simplified narratives suggested. The protests would continue. The nuclear program would remain a concern, and the strategic competition between Iran and the West would persist. But the fantasy that military strikes and economic pressure could solve the Iran question without messy political compromise had been exposed as exactly that, a fantasy. The reality was harder, more complex, and far less susceptible to simple solutions than anyone in Washington or Tel Aviv wanted to admit.